Hello everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you and really thank you so much for having me. Um, as you said, my name is Bella and I'm a postdoctoral fellow under the supervision of the inspiring and wonderful Professor Delphine Collin-Vézina at the Center on Research of Children and Families at McGill University. And originally I'm from Israel. I am a mother to Sunny and Tom, and I'm a partner to Dane. And I'm a social worker, and just until recently, I have still practiced social work with asylum-seeking children and families, mainly from Eritrea and Sudan, but from other African countries also. And my research focuses mainly on familial and relational dynamics in context of trauma, of polyvictimization, and intergenerational processes. And today, I would want to share with you my journey towards a better, I would say, understanding or conceptualization of the phenomenon of presence of significant others during abuse. And I just have to say before I start that most of my studies are devoted to bring the voices of the people who have experienced child sexual abuse to the front stage and to learn about those experiences from them. That's why the examples I would bring today might contain descriptions of abusive behaviors. So I thought maybe some of you would want to know that ahead. And having said that, let's start. So this journey of mine started about 6 years ago when I analyzed forensic interviews with children for a different research project. And I read an interview with this little Bedouin girl that disclosed a very severe and very continuous abuse from her oldest brother that was already an adult during the abuse. And this girl said like this: he took me to the living room. My parents slept in the bed where I was, but they slept deeply. Our family sleeps deeply. And the sofa made noise, and I cried and screamed, but no one woke up. And I remember when I read this interview that I understood that there is here something deep that this girl was trying to say about her family dynamics that has prevented her family members from waking up when she cried for help. But at that time, I wasn't sure how to call or how to conceptualize that something because the terms that I had in the mind at the time, as the bystanders or onlookers, for example, seemed to dismiss the familial context that was so evident in this girl's testimony, in this girl's interview. So I have conducted a scoping literature review in order to get a broader understanding of what is known today about the presence of significant others during child abuse, during child sexual abuse. And I have looked for lots of combinations of terms in 6 different databases. And I really found more than 1,000 articles that I read, but out of them, only 15 met the inclusion criteria and referred to actual physical presence of other people besides the perpetrator and the child during the abuse. And from this scoping review, I have learned mainly that the others could be simply anyone. It is very heterogeneous group. In age, in degree of familiarity, it could be a family member, a neighbor, friend's parent, a doctor, and etc. And the presence, even without a direct harm for the others, takes a difficulty on those present. They experienced guilt and shame and anger, embarrassment, powerlessness, emotional pain. All those emotions were very prevalent among the others present, whether they intervene or not. And from more of a microsite, I have learned that the knowledge in this area is based on 2 main perspectives. The first one is centering on bystanders and onlookers, but this perspective was more about unfamiliar people to the child. And this perspective didn't take into consideration family dynamics, loyalty, secrecy, and another psychological mechanism that usually involved in those situations. And the second perspective was really about intrafamilial dynamics, but it was more from a perspective of responses to disclosure or intergenerational transmission of trauma, and less about that physical presence that they looked for. And above all, I understood that there was no almost any empirical evidence of the people who have experienced the abuse themselves and how they perceive the others that were present, and of how this presence actually shaped their understanding of what happened to them, of their feelings, of all this experience. So together with the wonderful Professor Kermit Katz, that was my supervisor, we conducted a series of 4 qualitative studies in which we analyzed forensic interviews with children who have sexual abused, forensic interviews with children who have been physically abused. We analyzed written testimonies that were sent to the Israeli Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. That inquiry was established and managed by Professor Kermit Katz. And finally, we analyzed in-depth retrospective interviews. And those 4 studies together echo complex and multi-dimensional picture of the children's experiences of intrafamilial child abuse regarding the others present during this abuse. And I'm happy to share with you today some of our key findings from those 4 studies. So the first study we conducted was qualitative thematic content analysis of 24 child forensic interviews with girls. The girls aged 4 to 14, and they were from very diverse socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds in Israel. The sample included secular girls and religious and ultra-Orthodox, Jewish and Muslim girls. And all of the girls had suffered from ongoing and extremely severe abuse within their family. It was really severe sample that contained very, very severe abusive incidents and events. And the others that were present were also very close figures, like the mother, other siblings, and in some cases it was the grandmother and the aunt. And the first thing that the participants in this study taught us is that the awareness of the presence of the others during the abuse is not a trivial thing. The participants draw a kind of a range, a kind of an axis, that on one side of it was a full awareness of the presence of others during the abuse. In this end, the children knew that there are others that know about their abuse. For example, one of the participants described that her mother saw her brother above her, and that participants heard her mother telling about this to the father and heard the father's instruction not to tell anyone else. So even though it wasn't never spoken about it again, that participant as a child, she knew that her parents knew about her abuse. And on the other end of the axis, there were participants who simply didn't know, they were not aware that other family members and other significant others know about their abuse. So one participant, for example, told about the situation where her mother entered to the room and saw her father abusing the girl. And the mother looked at them and left. But in the girl's perspective, she understood from it that the mother didn't see anything or didn't understand anything. And therefore, in her perspective, the mother remained unaware of the abuse. And in between these 2 sides of the axis, there were participants who were not entirely sure whether the others in their family knew about their abuse or not. Those participants told about lots of explanations they gave to themselves about how those other people didn't see or didn't notice. For example, the mother here in this example that I brought was like she was if asleep, and another said things that it happened under the blanket, or the mother was stand with her back to us, or was talking on the phone for a moment, or didn't look at us. So they gave themselves those kind of explanation that might explain what happened and why the others didn't see, but still they were not entirely sure that they were busy, I'm sorry, with this question, how it could be that they didn't see, they didn't notice. And another important finding of this study is that the central experience for those participants were profound loneliness. The study participant described this loneliness in two main levels. The first one was the loneliness and the isolation from the other family members who didn't hear them. No matter how much they call and scream for help, they were not heard. This girl said, I scream and call, but who will hear me? No one hears me. And the other level was the isolation that the perpetrator himself creates, abusing those children who are less connected to other family members, or those who have no one to turn to, using all kinds of imprints and strategies that cause them to give up from disclosure even without trying to disclose. And the last thing that I would share from this study is that the change in family dynamics that occur as the abuse continues. The first thing is that as the abuse continued, the perpetrator made less and less efforts to hide it from the other family members. As longer the abuse lasted, the more and more it became intertwined with the family routine and took place on more public and familial places and occasions, some parallel plane or unspoken parallel reality. And as one participant shared, that at first she would run away to sleep with her mother because there she was protected. But over time, it stopped helping her because her brother that was abusing her would go to her mother's bed, take her and return her without any interference. And the second thing that changes in family dynamics over the time was how the roles in those abusive dynamics, and I mean roles like the perpetrator, the victim, the other, became fluid and flew between the different family members. I mean, sometimes someone who started out as the other later became another perpetrator, or the victim starts perpetrating or become the other present during the abuse of their siblings, for example. So those roles changed throughout the family members. And maybe in a bit of a broader perspective, knowing that there are others who see, who hear, and know about the abuse, together with the collective silence about it, place the participants in between the trauma of abuse and the trauma of betrayal. I could say that the trauma of abuse is characterized usually by objectification and I could say intrusive violence of the boundaries of the self and profound erosion of competence and self-worth. And the trauma of betrayal, together with all this, is accompanies the experience of being betrayed by someone who is very central in one's relationship, that is often a primarily attachment figure. And these powerful and influential figures failed to acknowledge the most significant and the most painful events in their lives. So in between those traumas, the research participants were simply left alone, and sometimes even in a house full of people who on one hand knew about the abuse, but from another hand didn't know. They didn't have a single person they could share what they have experienced, because every such conversation of sharing would mean disclosing the abuse, and the burden of this disclosure was only on their shoulders. No one helped them and talked with them about this abuse. And in the second study, I wanted to look more closely at how the presence of others shaped the experiences of children who were physically abused within their families, because I thought that their experience might differ from, like in important ways, from those of children who had been sexually abused. This sample included 26 forensic interviews. That time it was only Jewish children, but it were boys and girls who were aged 5 to 13. And they were also from secular and religious backgrounds. And in many cases, the children here described being physically abused by both parents, with one parent actively abusing while the other was present. And with those roles alternating between themselves, between the parents, I mean. And in the other cases, the abuse was carried out consistently by one parent, while the other remained present during the incidents, and sometimes siblings or members from the extended family were present as well. So one of the first things I learned from this study is that even though the abuse could start almost at any moment and in any place, and often completely unexpectedly, once it began, it tends to follow a very clear pattern over the time. Usually something in the child's behavior acted as a trigger for the perpetrator that would often lead to shouting or verbal aggression. The child would try to defend themselves or respond in some way, which only escalated the perpetrator's anger. At that point, the situation would typically intensify, moving from yelling and verbal abuse into physical violence. And after the violent episode, the perpetrator would usually leave, and the child was left alone to deal with what just happened. Many of the children described the ways they learned to cope with, on their own, both mentally and physically. Some talked about giving themselves permission to cry. Others described going to take a shower, attending to their injuries, or bandaging themselves, or putting ice on their bodies. For example, this girl that just a second. Yes, I'm sorry. Before the example, I would share another finding that much like in the previous study, and in some ways, I think even more clearly, the different people in the family took on different roles depending on the situation. The family, the same child in the same family, for example, might be harmed by his mother when his sister was present, and in another situation, he might be the one hurting his sister when the mother was there. I mean, the roles were not fixed. They shifted constantly in the children's accounts. And what stood out is how quickly and fluidly those roles changed, with abusive dynamics moving back and forth between the family members and and across different subsystems within the family. That means the violence didn't belong to one person or to one relationship alone. It circulated within the family system in very complex and very unstable ways. And here the example that I wanted to share is with this girl saying, "Mom came into the room to help me, and she was shocked when she saw all the blood. She saw me crying and understood that I was in pain. She tried to help me bandage myself, and then when I wanted to prepare something to eat, she suddenly started pulling my hair, and I didn't understand why. My dad, who stood by, and the dad was the one who abused her before, protected me from her and helped me. Also, my sister was at home at the day. She also was terrified." And it seemed that in order to cope with both the physical pain of the injury itself and the emotional pain that came with it, that was also embedded with the trauma of betrayal that we talked earlier, the children relied on two main strategies. The first one They tried as much as they could to minimize what had happened in their own narratives, to shrink the injury, to soften the meaning, and to make it feel smaller and less significant. And the second strategy was to reinterpret the abuser's intentions. Many children describe the harm they experience as an attempt of their parents to teach them something, to help them in any way, not to cause harm. And in this way, I think in order to live with the so deeply fragmented reality of having one parent who is both the caregiver and the perpetrator and the abuser, the children draw on very familiar psychological mechanism called identification with the aggressor by Ferenczi. They adopted the abuser's perspective, and in the context of this study, often the perspective of the other family members who witnessed the abuse and failed to intervene, as it was the accepted reality. And through this lens, the abusive figure was framed as someone who meant well, who wasn't truly causing harm, or whose actions were not such a big deal after all. And this became the narrative through which the children tried to make sense and survive both traumas, the trauma of the abuse and the trauma of betrayal. And now moving forward to the third study, that was the stage where I moved from analyzing children's narratives to listening to adults who were looked back on their childhood experiences of abuse. And this study was part of a broader series of studies conducted by the Israeli Independent Inquiry into Childhood Sexual Abuse. And as part of its work, this inquiry invited adults who had been sexually abused as children to submit written testimonies through an online platform. And the goal was to allow the inquiry members to learn directly from the survivors' narratives, and based on these narratives to draw conclusions and promote a meaningful, and what we wanted is to promote a wide-ranging policy change in the field. And in total, we really had more than 500 written testimonies that were submitted. And from this larger pool, I focused on testimonies that referred to intrafamilial abuse and that included some references to other people being present during the abuse. So using this criteria, I identified 16 relevant testimonies, and those were the testimonies that I analyzed for this study. So one of the most striking things, just a second to see, yes, sorry. Wanted to see that I didn't miss anything. So one of the most striking things that I found out in this study was that the participants described the family system itself as a fertile ground for the development of the abuse. In their accounts, it wasn't simply that the abuse happened and then the family members or the significant others failed to step in and help. Rather, the abuse happened because those significant others were unable to provide protection. I mean, the absence of intervention wasn't experienced as a separate failure that followed the abuse, but as something deeply embedded in the family dynamics that allowed the abuse to occur and to persist in the first place. This is how the participants described in her family, one participant. She said she was abused by her grandfather, and she said he abused at least 4 of my sisters. And one of the reasons he couldn't do it to my younger cousins is that we had no one to talk to. Our parents were emotionally unavailable. My mom had also been abused when she was a little girl. And in this context, the participants made a clear distinction between different kinds of others. On one hand, there were those who didn't see or hear what was happening, and who were therefore perceived as largely unaffected by the abuse. And on the other hand, there were those who were aware of the situation but were unable to help. People from whom the participants didn't expect much, or whom they didn't feel like they could turn to or talk with about what was happening. Similarly, this participant says, my mother was dealing with complex PTSD, experiencing revenge attacks, and had gone through sexual abuse herself. In my opinion, my father never processed his own abuse either, so I had no one I felt I could talk to. I didn't feel I could approach either of them with something like this. And what was especially striking was that the trauma of betrayal didn't diminish the participants' longing for visibility or for recognition from their family members. And even after repeated experiences of being unseen or ignored, this expectation that the harm and the abuse would somehow be acknowledged, it didn't disappear over many, many years. The lack of visibility within the family, the fact that most significant people in their lives didn't truly see what had happened, left the injustice they experienced without validity, without testimony. And it seems that as the participants moved throughout life, and the more they were able to understand and to articulate for themselves the nature of the injustice that was done to them, the stronger their longing became for this recognition. They wanted those family members who didn't see, they wanted them to see, to acknowledge even years after. And throughout their lives, many continued to seek for this sense of testimony. And when I say testimony in this sense, I mean a fundamental experience, very human experience that we often take for granted, but we take it for granted when it exists, until it's missing. Because in a nurture and protective environment, family members usually act as witnesses when you think about it. They see what happens, they respond to it, they express concern, they offer protection, they take responsibility on our lives. And when this testimony is absent, it becomes very difficult, and sometimes from those testimonies, even impossible for a person to fully tell their story or share what is held inside. Testimony requires witnesses who are willing to listen. And without such listeners, the story has nowhere to land. And the participants in this study help us understand what is the practice of this testimony, what they wanted to get from their family members. And there is one participant that captures it especially clearly. She was 62, I think, when she submitted her testimony, and she said, she wrote, if my mother were alive today, and was going through this process with me, I would be so happy about it. Even today, to hear from her that she is proud of me, to hear from her that she knows that I went through something that wasn't okay. Just she knows it wasn't okay. That's sympathy, just that. That she'd say that I wasn't the one to blame. And through her words, I think we began to see how the testimony is on one hand something very simple and basic, but from the other hand is so central and life-shaping in their experiences. If after all those years, in age of 62 and sometimes later, they still want to get this sympathy. And these findings resonate very strongly with the ethical theory of the philosopher Theodor Adorno. What participants described again and again was that their suffering wasn't truly seen by their families, that the abuse they experienced was never gained visibility in the family. And in this context, Adorno's concept working through the past becomes especially relevant. Adorno argued that societies must recognize past injustices, study them seriously and in depth, and take collective responsibility for what has occurred. And he emphasized that recovery, or what he himself calls recovery, I'm not sure that in sexual abuse recovery is the rightest word, but he talked about recovery cannot occur without public acknowledgement of the harm of the abuse. And according to Adorno, listening to survivors' testimonies, learning from them, and giving them a public platform isn't an optional but a moral obligation of society. And without that public and social recognition, as he argued, there cannot be a real possibility of recovery. And in a very, very similar way, I think, the participants in this study also expressed a deep longing for public recognition of what they had endured. Many actively sought such recognition, and they were willing to pay very heavy personal and relational costs in order to make their experience visible and acknowledged. As this young man, he wrote, I constantly felt the need to tell my story and justify myself. I would see it 4 or 5 times a day, every day, with guys from school and tell them the whole story from beginning to end, again and again and again. And the fourth and the final study I would like to share with you today is the study that included 20 participants that were that I had an in-depth interviews with them. And what makes this study different from the studies that we talked earlier is that because it was an in-depth semi-structured interview, I could of course, I developed the interview guide myself, and I could adapt it individually for each participant. So the narratives I got were very, very rich. And this study essentially reveals 3 ecological layers through which the participants understood the presence of significant others during their abuse. And those layers were the child's inner world, the microsystem that surrounds the child, and the ecosystem that included the institutional and the social forces. And together, these layers, I think they show how the absence of the acknowledgement and the recognition doesn't remain external, but it becomes internalized. And it left the children longing often throughout their whole life for this external validation and for this recognition that the injustice that was done to them would be acknowledged, would be seen. So the findings suggest that when there was no any testimony, when no one named what was happening, the victims, the children, were left alone. They were left the only present in those abusive incidents, and that it didn't mean that they were alone emotionally. I mean, they were left alone to make sense of what happened to them. So the burden wasn't only carrying out the memory, it was having to assemble a coherent story from something that felt confusing and fragmented and sometimes unreal. And many participants described how, without a validating narrative around them, they tried to fill the gaps on their own and to process over years very confusing stories, confusing narratives, and their interpretations were very painful, sometimes distorted, sometimes simply wrong. For example, this woman told about her being abused by her uncle, and she said, I remember that in the middle of the one situation, my aunt walked into the room. He quickly got dressed and left. My aunt took me to her bed and said he was going to work. After that, she didn't say a word, and neither did I. But I remember feeling so ashamed of all the things I could think about. I thought about her. I felt sorry for her. I didn't want to disappoint her. And no one explained her that she was the one that was abused, that she was the one that she wasn't responsible. And the second layer regarding the microsystem, the participants in the study made it very clear to me that from their perspective, the presence during the abuse doesn't have to mean physical presence. When I started this journey, I looked for physical presence, for articles and studies that talked about physical actual presence during the abuse. So here, the participants told me you were wrong. Awareness that the abuse is happening is enough. According to the participants of this study, the category of others included everyone who knew, everyone who heard, who should have understood from their behaviors or from the situation itself that something was wrong and should have intervened. This included very, very extended family members who saw parts of the abuse, school staff who should have recognized signs of distress and act, or social services. All those people, all those actors were others for these research participants. And on the exosystem level, many participants weren't only struggling inside their family. They were also trying to get the system around them to see what was happening. Several described a repeated effort to make the abuse visible to people and the institutes beyond their immediate micro world. As for example, this participant, she told me about going herself to the welfare department in her town where she lived. And she said, I told them without details, just said what I was going through. And I asked if I could go to boarding school. And they said, listen, it doesn't work like that. We first need to come to your house, see what's going on, and then decide. And I told them, listen, if you come to my house and see what's happening and then you will leave, my parents will know I reported and they don't know what will happen to me later. They said, these are the regulations and there is nothing we can do. In this sense, I think the stories reinforce the idea that the challenge wasn't only the abuse itself, but the exhausting and so often unsuccessful work of trying to translate the private reality into something that external systems would recognize as harm, would recognize as abuse. So this is as far as I've come in my journey so far, but in my view, this journey is not yet complete, and there are still many open questions, many things I feel I still need to understand. One direction I'm especially interested is exploring further the perspectives of the others themselves, their experiences, meanings, and positions within these dynamics. I'm also very interested in examining the role of the criminal and legal proceedings in this phenomenon, because I think that presence and witnessing and testimonies carry not only the relational and the moral weight, but also some legal responsibility. So, and finally, the last and perhaps the most sensitive direction I want to touch on is the figure of the mother, because across all the narratives, across all the 4 studies, mothers occupied a very unique and deeply central role that I'm still thinking very carefully about how to approach this analytically and ethically, but it feels impossible to move forward without engaging more specifically with this. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. I will stop my share.